So the question was asked, how does an interest group get attention from the government? And I think it's important in chapter 12 to really kind of focus on the major point or the major activity of interest groups. And that is to try and influence, either directly or indirectly, the activities of the government. It could be to influence government policymakers. It could be to influence government decisions, government actions, a wide variety of aspects that interest groups seek to come together and to try and influence through either direct or indirect means. And I think for the direct aspect, the best example is to think about lobbying and the activity of lobbying. Now, in the textbook, the definition of lobbying: an attempt by a group to influence the policy process through persuasion of government officials. And what we know in political science is a lot of research has been done and a lot of studying has been done on lobbying, the techniques, the approaches, the ways that interest groups try and pursue lobbying effects. I think there's an important concept to think about when it comes to interest groups and how direct influence through lobbying is done. And that's the idea of what political scientists have called the iron triangle. You can think about this as the iron triangle of power, what some political scientists call the subsystem. And what we talk about is taking the three parts of a triangle and thinking about the actors, the players in this iron triangle of power. First and foremost, congressional committees. These are the core players in terms of the government activities that oftentimes define, that oftentimes delegate, that oftentimes authorize power to be distributed that interest groups ultimately want to influence. And what congressional committees do in that delegation or directing government power is to administrative agencies, known as the bureaucracy. The final component of this iron triangle of power are indeed interest groups. And so what we will, and I'll give you an example here in just a minute of the iron triangle kind of in play. But these three key players, the congressional committees, the administrative agencies, and the interest groups, all make up a kind of subsystem within the government process that is crucial in terms of understanding the power of lobbying or direct influence. Now, if you take an example of the policy issue of tobacco, I think you can very easily lay out the iron triangle and think about this particular policy area of tobacco in a very distinct way. Again, taking the triangle, one of the most influential congressional committees on the Hill regarding tobacco are the agriculture committees, both in the House and in the Senate. These are oftentimes made up of legislators, either representatives or senators, who have a lot of farmers in their district or in their state. They'll try to work their way onto the Agriculture Committee to help their constituents, farmers, and the like. The key administrative agency that works in this tobacco area has been the Department of Agriculture. Not surprising. You've got the ag committees in Congress, you have the ag department in the bureaucracy. the one that has to carry out the orders and the legislation. The final component, and this is the interest group, is indeed the tobacco company lobbyist. They are the ones that oftentimes are working on Capitol Hill or working with the Ag Department directly to influence, to try and persuade, to try and have their policy goals met. Now, in thinking about how each player interacts with the other, the House and Senate Agriculture Committees interact with the Department of Agriculture by basically creating the laws, that writing the legislation that affects tobacco growers and distributors. That is where that influence by the committees are going to be on the lobbyist, and particularly the tobacco companies. From the perspective of the Department of Agriculture, their influence to the Agriculture Committee is the fact that they oftentimes provide technical information. They can help a member to write the piece of legislation. They can provide the background. They can provide the expertise for the committees to write their legislation. From the tobacco aspect, the tobacco companies aspect, the Department of Agriculture is going to regulate, is going to oversee the tobacco companies, what they can do, how they can do their products. All of that is going to be influenced by the Department of Agriculture. And when we get into the bureaucracy, we'll talk about the power of regulations and rulemaking. From the tobacco company, their influence is going to be on the members of the Agriculture Committee, oftentimes to provide also expertise, knowledge, and information, much like what the Department of Agriculture can do, but they want to present the information in the best way to help them. Another particular aspect that companies can do in terms of influencing and seeking to get favorable legislation from the members of the Agriculture Committee is to support candidates, oftentimes with campaign contributions done through political action committees. The final interaction, the tobacco company to the Agriculture Department. And here what we're talking about is client support for the programs, the initiatives that the Department of Agriculture seeks to put forward. So that's kind of the classic iron triangle scenario when it comes to policies and issues about something like tobacco. What we know in today's environment, however, is a very different and more complex network. And what I've presented here is a political scientist by the name of Hugh Heclo, and he talked about the idea that it's not so much the iron triangle anymore, made up of the agriculture committees, the Department of Agriculture, and the tobacco companies, but it's really the idea of issue networks. And this takes the idea of influencing and lobbying to a much broader circle kind of an idea. Yes, you still have the three major players, but along with the Agriculture Committee, you could potentially have something like the Commerce Committee in the House and in the Senate have influence or perspectives over tobacco use, perhaps more the regulation. Who can buy tobacco? What kind of nicotine count there could be? That's all within the Commerce Committee's influence. Another important committee is the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. How much funding will be spent for tobacco programs that are housed within the Department of Agriculture? Speaking of the bureaucracy and the Department of Agriculture, perhaps there's an agency that might conflict with the Department of Agriculture. Certainly agriculture wants to promote farming, wants to promote things like tobacco growth, but the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, may decide, you know what, we need to regulate, we need to put limits on tobacco use. That could be a conflict amongst the bureaucracy. Along with the tobacco companies, what we could see is also the American Lung Association, a group, an interest group that seeks to promote healthcare and medical concerns about the influence of tobacco. Other players within this issue network, the coverage by the media, perhaps think tanks, oftentimes doing research on the influence of tobacco. State agencies could also be important players, not just state departments of agriculture, say North Carolina's Agriculture Department, but also the Department of Health and Human Services at a state level. And then also universities who do research in a variety of areas. So moving past this idea of a very limited iron triangle, we see the triangle kind of break out into a circle with multiple players for modern, complex policy issues. So that's the major way that an interest group can get the attention from the government of direct lobbying. There's also indirect lobbying, and this is seeking to influence outside of the government process. Oftentimes interest groups will do a variety of things, and in the textbook it talks about the ideas of indirect influence, such as trying to shape public opinion. Interest groups may run advertisements, they may run commercials to try and shape a particular issue within the public's opinion about that policy issue. They could also try and shape the candidates and the elections. And this is often done through campaign finance, through contributions from things like political action committees engaged in the campaigns and the electioneerings. I would strongly encourage you to look at Lowy, the textbook, particularly chapter 11, pages 376 to 390. I think they do a really good job in giving a very brief but expansive overview of the different types of activities that interest groups engage in, both directly and indirectly, to get attention from the government.